I get here? Am I really good enough? Do I belong? These are the thoughts that pop into the heads of many when they allow imposter syndrome to seep in. When we find ourselves in spaces or our dream jobs soon coming to feel less competent, marginalized, or inadequate. Oh, that dreaded imposter syndrome. But no, that's not what applies here, because that 1970s narrative needs to be put to rest. What you're actually experiencing is a privilege, opportunity, performance paradox, a POP paradox. That sense of confidence, belonging, and feeling validated that we hope for just doesn't seem to be there. This leads us to question our abilities, our accomplishments, having a fear that we might just be a fraud, don't belong, and this all may be due to chance or even tokenism. Well, actually, you do deserve to be there. You are competent. You did work hard for opportunities and all that you've achieved, unless you got there as a result of gaming the system or by privilege. You see, the privilege opportunity performance paradox, POP, comes about when you question your abilities or whether you belong, often mistaking it for imposter syndrome. People are hired for positions or brought into systems, yet when it's time to perform, what makes the difference is whether you were given an opportunity or there due to privilege. When opportunity meets preparation, you can perform, showcasing your talents and abilities when given the right support. The person who got there by privilege might not be able to perform, whereas the person who was given an opportunity can, but instead comes to second guess their abilities as a result of spaces falsely operating under the auspices of diversity, equity, and inclusion while failing to create an authentic sense of belonging, empowerment, and appreciation. Being Black and a woman, the intersectionality of my identities often calls my abilities and my presence to come into question, especially as to whether I'm competent or even belong. Should I ever succumb to imposter syndrome like 70% of the population does, I wouldn't be the person I am today. This should lead us to question whether imposter syndrome is actually the result of unsupportive systems and toxic environments that people come to find themselves in and are expected to perform. I can recall the first time imposter syndrome tried to creep in, actually finding myself in the midst of my first privilege, opportunity, performance paradox, POP. As an undergraduate at the University of Florida, I was a freshman in a senior level sociology course where the professor had written the textbook. He was well respected in his field, and the students dared not question his ideas as they were on the cusp of graduating and didn't want to jeopardize that. He engaged my classmates in a conversation about campus diversity and stated the only reason Black students were present was because of athletic scholarships and affirmative action. There was one other Black student in the room, sporting a short afro and sinking into her seat, but she kept quiet. There I sat in the front left corner of the room, dressed in my cross-country sweatsuit and running shoes. And I definitely looked the part of what he described. I felt all of the 20-something pair of eyes shift towards me, as one by one, each of them echoed the professor's sentiments. POP! I paused for a second to question the truth in their statements, quickly seeing how they were all wrong, as I was there based on my academic merits, even though I excelled at athletics. I am my ancestors' wildest dreams, but in that room, I was their ancestors' worst nightmare, worthy of judgment as not belonging or being competent. POP! In that moment, I felt the first feelings of what many call imposter syndrome. However, I didn't succumb to it, quickly refuting it, because I knew who I was and who I could become. I wasn't there because of privilege. I was grateful for the opportunity and worthy of it, and I definitely was capable of performing. Yet there I sat, in the middle of a privilege, opportunity, performance paradox, POP, and I'm grateful I didn't succumb to imposter syndrome, then or now. I graduated with honors, went to get a master's in occupational therapy, then a PhD, and have my own business, Gifts Institute. So an imposter? I am not. That term, imposter syndrome, was coined in the late 1970s, yet here we sit still embracing such notions and giving life to it. At what point do we decide to put a death to this narrative and instead consider how systems and inept individuals play a part? It's time we take a different approach and look for the optimism in the opportunity, as we require inclusion and belonging to be the cornerstone of our experiences. We must move beyond perpetuating privilege and principles that foster inequities and injustices in schools, workplaces, the community, and beyond. So how do you put a death to the imposter syndrome narrative and instead face the privilege, opportunity, performance paradox head on? You do so by intentionally addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion while including anti-discrimination as part of those initiatives. As a leader, advocate, and when working in this space, I make sure to add the A for anti-discrimination in efforts to promote justice and equity. I prefer to call it addressing the idea: inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-discrimination. With inclusion, you can embrace all of the other concepts of diversity, equity, and anti-discrimination, but must also create an intentional sense of belonging. Without diversity, inclusion can't exist. We must respect each other, recognizing diversity of identities, thought, and abilities. Equity requires promoting justice and leveling the playing field by giving those who have been marginalized the opportunities to have resources, to succeed, avoid tokenism, and giving credit and compensation for contributions. Anti-discrimination requires that we stand up for those who experience discrimination based on their race, ethnicity, abilities, gender, sexual orientation, and other identities. Many who find themselves battling imposter syndrome most likely are struggling with navigating systems that lack authentic inclusion, have limited diversity, are not equitable, and even border being considered discriminatory in their policies and practices. They find themselves in the middle of a pop paradox. If we are to move beyond imposter syndrome at the individual, organizational, and societal levels, we must change all of this, making it more than just an idea. Individually, we must have conscious conversations and engage in reflective practices, asking these questions. Am I embracing self-defeating ideas that really don't fall within me, but instead are rooted in the environment and systems I operate in? What are my identities and the privileges, advantages, opportunities, and barriers associated with them? What are my personal biases and how do they impact others? What is my role in maintaining or dismantling systems that perpetuate injustices and discriminatory practices that feed into imposter syndrome? At the organizational level, whether an institution, workplace, or even family, we need to engage in critical analyses of our culture to determine how this can be aligned to support inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-discrimination authentically. Change can start at the top, middle, or bottom, but it starts with intentional actions and a commitment to address inequities. At the societal level, we must identify and dismantle structural, institutional, and systemic practices that perpetuate inequities and give life to imposter syndrome. Only then can we promote authentic inclusion and supportive environments that create a sense of belonging in the schoolhouse, workplace, and community. Putting a death to the imposter syndrome narrative can be more than just an idea. All you have to do is consider the privilege, opportunity, performance paradox. And when you feel that pin, get close enough before you hear pop and embrace imposter syndrome. Remember that the issue isn't you. It's actually the result of the systems you're struggling to exist in. Let's put a depth to the imposter syndrome narrative once and for all by intentionally embracing the idea and implementing initiatives to address inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-discrimination. Thank you.